The French Revolution set Europe ablaze. It was an age of enlightenment and progress, but also of tyranny and oppression. It was an age of glory and an age of tragedy. One man stood above it all. This was the Age of Napoleon. I'm Everett Rummage, host of the Age of Napoleon podcast. Join me as I examine the life and times of one of the most fascinating and enigmatic characters in modern history. Look for the Age of Napoleon wherever you find your podcasts.
I'm Jeffrey Rosen, President and CEO of the National Constitution Center. A few years ago, learning about the forgotten meaning of the pursuit of happiness changed my life. When the founders wrote that famous phrase in the Declaration of Independence, they meant an ongoing commitment to self-improvement and lifelong learning. This discovery inspired me to write a book, and in my new podcast, I explore the founders' lives with the historians who know them best. Plus, filmmaker Ken Burns shares his daily practice of self-reflection. Join me for Pursuit, the Founder's Guide to Happiness.
Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, a podcast about early American history with Liz Covart. The study of history is key to understanding who we are and how we can affect a better future. Ben Franklin's World will introduce you to historical people and events that have impacted and shaped our present-day world. And now, here's your host, Liz Covart.
Hello, and welcome to episode 31 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. Each week, we sit down with an historian to discuss their unique insights into our early American past so we can learn more about who we are and how we can affect a better future. I have a special treat for you today. A conversation all about Benjamin Franklin. Crazy, right? A podcast called Ben Franklin's World with an actual episode all about Benjamin Franklin? Franklin lived an inspiring life, one that spanned almost the entire 18th century. Born on January 17, 1706, Franklin lived a well-traveled and accomplished life before he died on April 17, 1790. Much of what we know about Benjamin Franklin, the printer, scientist, inventor, and statesman, comes from the papers he left behind. Michael D. Haddam, a research assistant for the Papers of Benjamin Franklin documentary editing project, joins us to discuss the life and deeds of Benjamin Franklin. During our conversation, Michael reveals how Yale University became home to the Papers of Benjamin Franklin documentary editing project and how that project began. Details about Benjamin Franklin's politics and activities during the American Revolution and its war for independence. And Michael also answers several listener questions about Benjamin Franklin, including what his job was like as postmaster and how he revolutionized the postal system of British North America. I know you are anxious to discover more about this inspiring founding father, so without further ado, let's meet Michael Haddam.
With tidings and wisdom to share about our early American past, here is this week's special guest.
Michael D. Haddam is a doctoral candidate in early American history and teaching fellow at Yale University, where he is writing a dissertation about history culture in colonial and revolutionary America. You may remember Michael from episode 23, when he discussed his role as a blogger and podcaster for the Junto blog, a group blog on early American history, and the Junto Cast, a monthly podcast on early American history. Believe it or not, Michael finds time in between all of these activities to serve the Papers of Benjamin Franklin documentary editing project as a research assistant. Welcome back to Ben Franklin's World, Michael.
Liz, it's good to be back.
Today, we will be chatting about Benjamin Franklin and the documentary editing project for his papers. Michael, would you provide us with a brief overview about the Papers of Benjamin Franklin documentary editing project and tell us how it began?
Sure. Well, the Franklin Papers began in 1954, but its origins really go back a few decades before that to 1935 when Yale acquired the personal historical collection of a alumni called William Smith Mason. He had graduated from Yale in the late 19th century. And he spent much of his life collecting anything having to do with Franklin and then anything having to do with basically the 18th century, Franklin's life and times, basically. And that included books about Franklin, books about things Franklin was interested in, pamphlets, newspapers, magazines, oil paintings, prints, and even a few busts. So we're talking about 20,000 pieces in total. It was really an amazing collection. And he originally created it for historians to use. Before the university acquired the collection, he let historians use it, access the collection in his home. But so they acquired the collection. They housed it in 3 connected rooms in Sterling Memorial Library. And so when in 1954 the Franklin Papers Editorial project began, its offices were located in those rooms, and it's still there today. And, as I said, it began in 1954 under the direction of Leonard Lavery with funding from Yale and the APS and actually even Life magazine. And since then, the Franklin Papers has published 41 volumes. The most recent was last year, which picked up right after the Treaty of Paris in September of 1783 and ended in February of 1784.
Yale has about 20,000 pieces of Franklin documents and papers and other things he left behind. How many papers did Franklin leave behind total, and where are they located at?
I don't know what the total is, but it's obviously, it seems to be in the tens of thousands. I mean, by the time that the Franklin Papers volumes are done, I think it's going to have upwards of 20,000 pieces of correspondence. And, that's not necessarily publishing everything. And Franklin's papers are housed in a number of places. Actually, a vast majority of what the Franklin Papers Project uses are photostat copies of stuff that is held elsewhere. And a lot of those documents are held in Philadelphia, as you can imagine, at the APS, at the Library Company, at HSP. And then beyond that, I mean, lots of places have a very small number of Franklin documents or correspondence.
And the APS is the American Philosophical Society, right?
Right.
And the HSP is the Historical Society of Pennsylvania.
Right.
So that's where a lot of his collections ended up as well.
And there's a lot, I shouldn't say a lot, but there's still, a decent amount that's held in private collections, right? There's collectors who own a few Franklin letters here or there. And, every once in a while, a letter pops up on the sort of auction market, that the papers collection wasn't aware of or didn't have a copy of. That's a pretty rare occurrence these days. But it does happen because some of his correspondence is still held by private collectors.
Franklin left a lot of papers behind, and I wonder about the process of editing. When we say editing, we typically think about clearing out bad grammar, adjusting poor word choice, or making our writing more readable. What type of editing does a documentary editing project undertake?
Right. So, documentary editing is not exactly, I guess, what you think of when you think of the term editing. The editing aspect of documentary editing in terms of an editorial project is sort of one part collection, one part curation, one part investigation, and one part explication. And together, that is what documentary editing is. You collect the documents, you decide what should be included, you research those documents, and then you offer annotations that help a reader better understand what they're reading. And, the process of the Franklin Papers is, I suspect, much the same, generally speaking, as at the other major papers projects. Documents are selected, transcriptions are double-checked by 2 editors. Once those transcriptions have been checked, documents go to an editor to be annotated, usually in batches of related letters, and then begins a very painstaking and in-depth level of research to produce annotations that help make it clear to the reader what's being talked about in the letter. And that can be identifying individuals, events, other letters referenced in the letter. It also includes contextualizing the letter within a larger conversation. And at the Franklin Papers, during this process, editors gather the materials they use. They write up a draft annotation. They write up research notes so that any other editor who looks at it can see exactly what sources they had checked, what issues there were, what judgment calls were made. And then those annotations actually undergo revision and then are checked again by two other editors. So basically, everything is seen by multiple editors at each stage. And it's that kind of diligence and devotion to accuracy that I think makes the Franklin Papers and the other major founders projects praised by historians all around the world as exemplary documentary editions.
Now that we know more about the Papers Project, let's talk about Benjamin Franklin, who we know as a printer, a scientist, a statesman, a diplomat, and a founding father. Would you provide us with a brief overview of Franklin's life and maybe try and put some of his accomplishments into order and context for us?
Franklin's life literally spanned the 18th century chronologically, right? But it also figuratively encompassed the 18th century. He was born in 1706 in Boston to a lower class family. And at a young age, he was apprenticed out to his brother as a printing apprentice. And he did some of his earliest writing on his brother's newspaper. And then, of course, he left Boston and went to Philadelphia, went to London, back to Philadelphia. He was a newspaper printer where he printed the Pennsylvania Gazette. In the 1730s, he began a sort of project of creating an institutional life in the city of Philadelphia by founding a number of voluntary associations like the Library Company, the College of Philadelphia, helped found the hospital. He was also a sort of entrepreneur or a businessman. That he wasn't just a printer who owned a print shop. He franchised out his printing business to printers in other colonies. He was also the postmaster general of the colonies. And all of those endeavors allowed him to retire sort of towards the end of the 1740s. And he basically entered political life from there. He was the colonial agent in London for a number of colonies. And then, of course, there's his revolutionary political career, which I'm sure we'll talk a lot about. But I think that really what remains interesting about Franklin is the way in which Franklin and his sort of image in our collective memory and popular culture is rife with contradictions and even paradoxes. His story is really sort of the most American of the founders, and yet he was the most cosmopolitan of the bunch, right? He's the earthy fur cap wearer in France, right? But in reality, he moved effortlessly through the highest circles of European courts. He was the folksy Poor Richard, and he was a master of international diplomacy. He's a local Philadelphia artisan, and he's America's famous scientist. He was a man of substance, but he understood the power of a public image, right? And he was a tireless entrepreneur, but he retired at the age of 42 and then was willing to forego the pursuit of money for the pursuit of public service and science after that. So Franklin was all of these things, and he was a man of many faces, and he wore a lot of those faces at the same time. And so, I mean, in some sense, I tend to think of it as Franklin basically played the 18th century like a violin.
And you mentioned that he franchised his business. That's a business technique you normally think of today. How typical was it for a printer like Franklin to franchise their printing business, or was this just an innovation that he made?
I don't know how much was done in England at the time, but it wasn't done in the colonies, right? Because, I mean, you had to have access to effectively capital, right? Because to be able to franchise out your business, he would basically provide the printer in another city with the press, with the type, and that kind of thing costs money. And so there was no other printer in the colonies that was franchising out their business when Franklin did it.
Working with someone's papers really gives you a good feel for who they are. And I wonder, now that you've really worked with the Benjamin Franklin papers and you've gotten to know more about him and almost on an intimate level, as intimate as you can when you're crossing so many centuries. But as you've gotten to know him better, is there anything about him that has surprised you? Is there anything about Franklin that most people don't know, but you think they should?
That's a great question. I have to say that for many years, the founder I was most familiar with and most interested in was Jefferson. I mean, I'd read a number of biographies of Franklin, of course, but I had experienced Jefferson through his correspondence with Adams and, through his published writings. And it's not a way that most people get to experience Benjamin Franklin. But over the last few years working at the Franklin Papers as a research assistant, I've come to really appreciate Franklin and have been routinely fascinated by him. One surprise that stands out is something I wrote about in a piece for the Gento blog last year. One day I was doing some reference checking and I came across these long alphabetical lists of prisoners. And it turns out that basically Franklin he effectively created an underground network between England and France during the Revolution to help American prisoners who had escaped from English prisons. And they were mostly seamen who had been captured on privateers. But what happened was prisoners started sending him letters in France asking him to help them. And a few who had escaped started showing up at his door, hoping that he could help them somehow get home. And eventually he set up this network of agents in England who the prisoners could go to get clothing, and if they were lucky, some money to get across the channel to France. And from there, they would go to Franklin's home, where he would give them enough money, a loan, on behalf of Congress to get to a port city and get a ship back home. And he would have them sign a promissory note that he printed himself on the press that he kept in his home. And there was surprisingly little work done on this. There's one article from about 40 years ago that was actually done by somebody who worked at the Franklin Papers at the time. And when I looked at the biographies of Franklin, by Van Doren, by Morgan, Isaacson, Wood, there's really no mention of it. And yet you could see from the lists and the correspondence with the agents that he spent a significant amount of time and energy and funds trying to help these sailors get from England to France and then back home. And he wrote about it in a letter to Robert R. Livingston, basically lamenting that he couldn't do more to help them. And then during the Constitutional Convention, at one point, James Madison proposed only allowing landowners the right to vote. And Franklin countered that by offering up the example of these prisoners, the virtue of these prisoners who, despite the horrible conditions of the prison, never, accepted the standing offer of immediate release for any of the prisoners who would join the British Navy. And so, the whole experience of having these desperate men show up at his home and of working, behind the scenes to help them get home really had a huge impact on him. And that story surprised me.
Dealing with these sailors was part of his experience in France. And you mentioned that the last volume released by the Papers of Benjamin Franklin was last year, and it was volume 41, which covered the period between September 1783 and February 1784. What types of other activities was Franklin doing in France, both during the Revolution and around that time of volume 41?
Right. Well, volume 40 covered the negotiations of the Treaty of Paris, and the negotiation of a number of commercial treaties with other European nations. And so volume 41, which follows that, this 6 months that's covered by the volume is very much sort of downtime for Frank, or at least, the Franklin's equivalent of downtime. At this point, Franklin's diplomatic duties had lessened considerably, and so he spent a lot more time focusing on scientific matters, and things like that. And it was in December of '83 that the first untethered balloon flight was made in Paris, and there's an amazing letter in the volume that Franklin wrote to Joseph Banks describing his experience attending the flight, and he called it a beautiful spectacle. He describes looking at the balloon through his pocket glass, and goes on to this. He wrote it the day of the flight and went on to tell Banks that he didn't understand the science behind how they intended to land the balloon, and so he was quite worried about whether the balloon was actually going to be able to land safely. But then he didn't send it for a couple of days, and the next day he got word it did land safely. So he added a postscript to Banks to say, indeed, the balloon had landed. But in this volume, there are actually 3 very important essays that Franklin wrote also. The first was actually a letter that he wrote to his daughter that was meant to be circulated that was very critical of the Society of Cincinnati. It was basically an attack on hereditary privilege. And he also wrote what's a very famous essay called Information to Those Who Would Remove to America. And so in this essay, which was published as a pamphlet, he's basically giving advice to Europeans who are considering emigrating to the new United States, but he's also at the same time warning certain kinds of people off. But it's actually the reverse of what you would expect. He's encouraging working class people to come, and he's warning off more wealthy people from coming. Basically, he says, it's not advantageous for anyone to come to America who has no other quality to recommend him but his birth. And, what Franklin is saying in the letter is it really doesn't matter what you have when you arrive, because if you're willing to work hard and be frugal, you can earn a living, perhaps start a business, raise a family. This essay is sort of a piece with the hereditary privilege essay. And it's important because it shows us that in the immediate wake of the war, how Franklin saw the promise of the country that he had served for past 2 decades, and much of that time he had spent away from it. America provided opportunity for industrious individuals regardless of their birth, wealth, or social standing in Europe. And, that's directly related to his own personal experience.
So it seems like he sees America as a land of opportunity, and he wants to encourage industrious immigrants to settle there. Did he just not want the wealthy to come? Did he not think that they would be successful, or he just didn't think that they would like a country that was not as necessarily as cosmopolitan as Europe? And by that, I mean is like there's a difference between Philadelphia in the 1780s and Paris in the 1780s.
Right. Well, he doesn't come right out and say that. The argument that he's making is basically he says, look, if you already have means in England or France or wherever you are, if you already have means, then it's not going to be worth it to you to come to the colonies, to the United States at this point, and think that you're going to find some kind of patronage type office position that's going to pay well, because he basically says, we don't have that kind of thing. And in fact, he actually talks about the wealth and income equality in America at the time compared to Europe, which he calls an almost general mediocrity of fortune, right? Which is to say that it's level, right? He wants to encourage the more industrious class of immigrants rather than the kind who think they're going to, make a living off government posts and things like that. Basically the way that it had been during the colonial period.
Before we leave Franklin during the Revolution, just 2 more questions about it. Franklin goes to France, and he is instrumental in getting the French to ally with the American cause and signing the Treaty of Amity Commerce in 1778 and the Treaty of Alliance. I'm curious as to what he thought of the other men who had come in and try, not necessarily to negotiate that treaty, but to help bolster relations with the French after that. So I'm thinking specifically of John and Abigail Adams, who come over and spend some time in France, and of course, Thomas Jefferson. What did Franklin think of these other people that would also be founders?
What he thought about Adams was, I think, to be charitable, was that he thought that Adams was not very suited to either France or diplomacy. Adams had a brusqueness about him and a sort of public honesty, I think, for lack of a better term. Adams was basically the antithesis of the archetype of Franklin's ways of operating as a diplomat. Adams did not fit what Franklin would have needed from, his diplomatic partners there. He had certainly had less sort of conflict with Jefferson, because Jefferson was not like Adams in that manner. But on the other hand, I think that his attitude for the most part was largely, don't get in my way. Don't get in the way of what I've been working here to cultivate for a number of years, and which, Adams' brusqueness at times did put at jeopardy. And so Franklin knew what he was doing, and he knew that, and he basically needed the other men in the diplomatic corps, whether it's Jefferson or Adams, to basically let him do his thing.
The other question I have actually goes back earlier in Franklin's role in the Revolution. In episode 22, we talked to Vivian Bruce Conger, who's been studying Franklin's wife, Deborah Reed Franklin, and his daughter, Sally Franklin Bache. And in that interview, Vivian talked about the Philadelphia Stamp Act, and she talked about how the rioters in Philadelphia actually targeted Benjamin Franklin's house because they believed him to be responsible for the Stamp Act. Would you tell us about Franklin's politics during this early period of the American Revolution, say the 1760s and 1770s, and about the role he played in imperial government before he became a patriot?
During the 1760s and 1770s, as I mentioned before, Franklin was living in London and was serving as the colonial agent for Pennsylvania and then eventually for Massachusetts and New Jersey and Georgia. And the sort of standard narrative about Franklin was that he was very much pro-British Empire, but that the events of the 1760s and especially his very negative treatment by ministry officials eventually converted him to the cause of independence. Now, in 1765, he was I wouldn't say, he wasn't a supporter of the Stamp Act, and he, did his best to convince many ministry officials that it was a sort of wrong-headed legislation. But in the end, there are letters from him to friends in Philadelphia that basically say, look, this is going to happen, and, it's not good, but basically we just need to accept it. He actually writes to someone and tells them, recommends to them that they seek to get one of the stamp distributor jobs, which is probably not one of his best pieces of advice. But in terms of that negative treatment, there are two famous incidents, right? During the Stamp Act, after the resistance, he's brought in to be questioned about the colonial response, and he lays out the colonists' argument against the act and their position regarding the relationship between the colonies and Britain, and there's a transcript of this, which is fascinating to read. And then in 1773, when things were getting much worse, Franklin got himself embroiled in a scandal when he published private letters that were written by Thomas Hutchinson, who was the governor of Massachusetts. And he sort of felt that Hutchinson had been misrepresenting the situation in Boston in order to get the ministry to deal with the colonies more harshly. And he published them to show that it wasn't the colonists who were sowing discord, but Hutchinson himself. The plan backfired, and he was brought before the Privy Council in early 1774 and was basically, subjected to an hour-long tirade by the Solicitor General. And it was after that he ended up leaving London. I think, as late as even the early 1770s, it is true that Franklin didn't want to see the colonies split from Britain. But as the whole thing dragged on, I think he became increasingly frustrated with the British imperial government generally and with the men who comprised it. Some historians argue that the Wedderburn incident was like the moment that Franklin went from being an enthusiastic subject of the empire to being, quote unquote, an American. That's, I think, far too simple an explanation for such a complex person as Franklin. I just think he began to see over time how the colony's interests and those of the empire differed. And, you combine that with his low opinion of the men running the government, and I think he really began to believe that what the government officials were intent on doing was what was best for themselves rather than the colonies or the empire as a whole. And I think it's the combination of those two realizations that, convinced Franklin that the resistance was not only justified but necessary.
John would like to know if the Franklin Papers editors have a trick or a process they use to determine whether or not Franklin wrote, an anonymous, witty newspaper essay. He suspects that there are a lot of witty newspaper essays that are attributed to Franklin that he didn't actually write.
Well, there's no trick, really. There's no, one way to do it. And initially, you might search his correspondence to see if he mentioned having sent a letter or a piece to a specific newspaper around the time the essay appeared, though finding that's quite a rare occurrence. The time when this was a major issue was many decades ago, actually, because it was in the 1760s and early 1770s that Franklin wrote the majority of his pseudonymous newspaper essays and letters. And a man named Vernon Crane did a lot of research on this and wrote a book about it called Benjamin Franklin's Letters to the Press, and it covers 1758 to 1775. And in it, he goes through the process of identifying these essays and, identifying attribution. Crane's process was, he had a very in-depth process of research, and for each essay that he includes, he also includes his reasons for why he thinks that the essay can be attributed to Franklin. And a lot of times it comes down to he finds phrases in an essay that are common in Franklin's correspondence at the time. That tends to be, one of the more common ways that he went about identifying these letters. And that book was published in 1950, which was before the Franklin Project began. And in those early volumes that Crane's volume covers, the Franklin editors, I guess, you could say to a good degree, relied on Crane's judgment. And I think that they were right to do so. Crane's the one who still to this day has done the most work on that. And so there's no real trick to it. There's just a number of techniques or approaches that you can take to try to figure it out. And obviously, there are probably a few letters in that volume that maybe Crane was wrong about, and there are probably others that Crane didn't find or didn't think were Franklin's. It's just an incredibly hard thing, to nail down completely. And so, as experts in the subject, we make the best estimation possible.
What a different time we live in now. Today, it's almost impossible to remain anonymous, but back in the 18th century, it was certainly possible. Chris would like to know about Franklin's relationship with Cadwallader Colden, who was a kindred spirits in terms of his experiments with nature and science. Would you tell us a bit about who Cadwallader Colden was and about his relationship with Franklin?
So, they weren't close personal friends. They were more like acquaintances, really correspondents, actually. Colden was a New Yorker who was originally born in Ireland, who was very much interested in science, and that sort of was the main reason behind their correspondence. Colden moved to the colonies in the early 18th century, and he was a physician. And he was eventually employed as a surveyor general of New York. So he did a lot of work upstate New York and ended up writing a fascinating history of the 5 Indian nations in upstate New York. And throughout these years, he, like, most other sort of liberal or enlightened gentlemen of the time, had a lot of correspondence, and he liked to correspond with natural philosophers or scientists. And he corresponded with Franklin over a period of about 20 years, from the early 1740s to the early 1760s, but the majority of it came between sort of 1750 and 1754. And they talked about, electricity. They talked about Newtonian physics. And Colden was convinced that Newton had got gravity wrong. They talked about light, magnetism, astronomy, all the kinds of things that sort of scientifically inclined, enlightened gentlemen of leisure in the middle of the 18th century talked about.
Now, speaking of correspondence, Monique would like to know more about how Franklin facilitated it as postmaster. Now, she's been to Sturbridge, Massachusetts, and she's seen a historic marker that notes that Franklin used to deliver the mail between Philadelphia and Boston. Would you tell us about Franklin's duties as postmaster and whether he acted as a mail carrier too?
Postmasters were responsible for the postmaster of each city was responsible for the city's mail, but generally speaking, the postmaster received the posts, but the posts themselves were carried between cities by post riders, and the postmaster basically distributed them, not as like a mail carrier with a bag through their shop. If the city or town had a post office. So Franklin wasn't out walking around dropping letters off. Often when people were expecting a letter, they would stop by the shop or post office after they knew that the rider had arrived. But remember, I mean, mail was nowhere near as numerous as it is nowadays. And, most common people didn't send a lot of mail. And many people actually sent letters outside of the, official postal system. And so Franklin actually had a great hand in revolutionizing the postal system in the colonies after he became Postmaster General in 1753. One of the things he did was he redrew the postal routes to make them more efficient for the riders, and he had mile markers installed along the main post roads, which is what I guess Monique is referring to. He also sort of created a consistent accounting method for postmasters throughout the colonies. And he did, at the beginning, go on a long trip where he basically was inspecting post offices and the postal routes. And actually his reforms were so successful that the Postal Service made a profit for the Crown for the first time ever in 1760. So he was quite successful at reforming the Postal Service. But it was his doing to have those markers put down that Monique is talking about.
That's interesting. Although, I was starting to get an image of Franklin carrying the mail and giving, his little nifty, witty sayings to people as he walked by. Hello. And then something out of Poor Richard's Almanac. But that's just the way my mind works. Thank you for sharing the truth with us on that. So one last listener question. James would like to know about the accuracy of the portrayal of Franklin in History Channel's recent miniseries, Sons of Liberty. How accurate was actor Dean Norris's portrayal of Franklin in that show?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm afraid the accuracy of the portrayal of Franklin was basically equal to the accuracy of the rest of the show, which is to say largely non-existent. It seemed to me like they took 21st century characters and dressed them up in 18th century costumes and sets. He's called a womanizer and a drinker in the show by a British official. And, well, first of all people in the 18th century were drinkers. Water was unsafe, and so most people drank cider or beer. And in terms of the womanizing, Franklin cultivated a reputation, but his correspondence doesn't really offer us much evidence that he was engaged in all kinds of torrid affairs. He corresponded with many women, actually, especially younger women. But when Franklin came back from England in 1775, he's 69 years old at that point, and that reputation remained with him even throughout his time in France. Right. So it seems to me like that the rumors and speculation about Franklin on that end always seemed to me to be a bit overblown. I mean, he was human. He wasn't superhuman. But I think that, the narrative of the Sons of Liberty itself was highly problematic. And I should say that as a political historian, I found that the Continental Congress scenes sort of the most problematic, I guess, in a sense. If you really want to get a better sense of the actual Congress debates and the sort of manner of the debates, I think I would much rather recommend scenes from sort of HBO's John Adams miniseries, which I thought did the Continental Congress stuff much better than the Sons of Liberty.
Great. Now, we've talked about a lot of correspondence. We've talked about the Franklin Papers, Volume 41, that just came out. Does the Franklin Papers have a digital edition? If somebody was really interested in the papers of Benjamin Franklin but didn't want to invest in the volumes, is there a place on the internet that they could go and find his papers?
Yeah, absolutely. We actually have two digital editions. Franklin Papers were one of the first papers projects actually to be available online. Which they were able to do with the support of the Packard Humanities Foundation. That website you can find at franklinpapers.org. It even includes transcripts of documents that are yet to appear in a published volume. The only thing is that there's no annotations provided. You get just the transcriptions of the letters. And for the transcriptions of the unpublished documents, those, of course, aren't final. They're basically just they're provided for reference. But of course, the Franklin Papers, like the other major Founders projects, are also on Founders Online, which you can find at founders.archives.gov. And I think the Franklin Papers volumes 1 through 39 are currently on Founders Online, and 40 should be up. 40 and 41 should be up soon. I actually spent a lot of the last year and a half proofreading those volumes that are now on Founders Online. So I can personally attest to their high level of accuracy.
Well, thank you for that information. We'll include links to those locations on the show notes page for this episode. But with that, we should move on to the time warp. This is the fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently.
The time warp. Historians can't predict the future, but they can speculate about what might have been.
Michael, are you ready for your time warp question?
Indeed.
Okay. In your opinion, what might have happened if Benjamin Franklin had not run away from Boston? Do you think he would have found his way to Philadelphia anyway, opened his own press, and accomplished as much as he did if he hadn't run away?
That is a really interesting question. I mean, in some sense, because Franklin is so inseparable from Philadelphia. I actually visited Philadelphia for the first time a few years ago, and I was struck walking around just how present he still was in that city. I think he was able to get off the ground in Philadelphia because he was able to secure relationships with and sort of patronage from, important men, politicians, and that would have been much harder for him to do in Boston. Considering the reputation of himself and his brother. Remember, when he was an apprentice for his brother's printing shop, his brother printed a newspaper that was quite critical of the government, and his brother was actually jailed over what he had printed. And so, the Franklin name was not going to get him the kind of patronage that he needed in Boston. And in fact, the question actually reminds me of something I was just reading earlier today. It was sort of a tribute to Franklin. It was from the Boston Magazine in 1784. And it basically made the point that if he had been born in London to a family of the same means, that he would have ended up just living in obscurity without the opportunity to make the kind of contributions that he did. And, in some sense, that goes back to what we were talking about Franklin's vision for America. But I think, he was always going to be a printer, right? I mean, he had done his printing apprenticeship in Boston already, so he was already going to do that. So it's an interesting question, but I think he definitely would have always been a printer, and he certainly would have had a much harder time if he had stayed in Boston. I certainly don't think that he would have achieved the same thing, had the same opportunities open to him in Boston that he ended up having in Philadelphia.
As a Bostonian, I had to ask that question because we have never gotten over losing him. Even if you look right behind the King's Chapel, there's a statue of Benjamin Franklin, and that it stands where the old Boston Latin School used to be, which was founded in 1635. And we always proclaim he's our most famous dropout. We go by the Old South Meeting House, and they have the building that stands on the site of where he was born. Is there's big letters, Ben Franklin's birthplace, and they talk about how his parents walked him over to the Old South Meeting House to be baptized in January, and they say the water in the baptismal font was frozen at the time. But we talk about Franklin everywhere, and even in the Granary Burying Ground, some people, I forget when, late 18th century, I think it was actually in the 19th century, got together and held a big fundraiser for donations to build a monument to his family's graves because they were in such bad shape. But it was their way to pay honor to their native-born son. So Philadelphia claims him, but so does Boston. I just had to ask.
He held sort of a soft spot. He throughout his life, he's in relatively regular correspondence with family members who are still in Boston and the surrounding areas, and he's always interested in what's going on there, even before he's Massachusetts colonial agent. It sort of goes back to the question about the post office, and when the listener said that she had heard a story about him delivering mail to Boston. It's the whole legend of Franklin. It's the whole mythology of Franklin. It makes absolute perfect sense to want to claim Franklin for all that he's worth, for all that he represents.
And he also left the city money when he died. He left both Philadelphia and Boston an equal sum of money and allowed the cities to grow, I think, for 200 years because that was like a joke he had with someone. He's like, okay, and I'm going to do it. And the Franklin Institute here in Boston is named after him and was formed with the funds he left them. So before we conclude, would you tell us what aspect of Ben Franklin's life the Franklin Papers documentary editing project is working on editing now?
Like I was saying, that are up to February 1784 at the moment. And I think it's 2 more volumes before he comes home in the fall of 1785. This French period has occupied the project for decades at this point. And there's going to be 47 volumes, I believe, total. And, the remaining volumes are going to largely cover his final years as he's the president of the Supreme Executive Council in Pennsylvania, which is sort of basically like honorary governor in a sense. He actually he didn't. It was largely an honorary job, and even the Executive Council's job was largely they didn't have much responsibility, so it was sort of just a title. But he did that, and for about 3 years, and then of course he was a member of the Constitutional Convention in the summer of 1787. So the remaining volumes will cover that. So there's about 6 volumes to go at this point, and most of that will cover the final 5 years of his life that he lived out back home in Pennsylvania and Philadelphia.
And where is the best place to look for more information about the Ben Franklin Papers, its work, and how to get in contact with its editors?
franklinpapers.org you can go to, and there's information there about the project, how to order the volumes, other information about Franklin. There's lots of ways to contact the editors. You can email them. You can you can call the office. People still actually call the Franklin Papers offices when they have a question related to Franklin. You can do that. Visitors to Yale are welcome to stop into the Franklin collection itself.
So the next time we're in New Haven, we can stop on by. Now, I lied. I did have one last question that just occurred to me. Did he prefer to be called Ben or Benjamin? Because with Samuel Adams, it was Samuel Adams, not Sam.
The thing is, because, in correspondence, when you read correspondence is addresses in 18th century correspondence aren't done the way that we do them now. Of course, they were quite formal. And so, there's letters aren't addressed, there aren't letters from his close friends that are addressed to Ben, and then letters from, acquaintances that are addressed to Benjamin. People didn't address each other in letters, generally didn't address each other by names like that. Usually letters were addressed, sir, or if you had an honorary title. And I've never read a piece of his correspondence where he said, I wish this guy would stop calling me Ben. I actually don't know I don't know if he had a specific preference, or if there were some people, within certain people that he let call him something or not.
Perhaps this is a historical mystery, or perhaps someone out there knows and they can tell us. Well, Michael, thank you so much for coming back onto Ben Franklin's World and chatting with us, and this time about Benjamin Franklin.
Thank you for having me, Liz.
Benjamin Franklin's accomplishments as a revolutionary and statesman are well known. But as Michael shared with us, there are many details about the life and politics of this well-known founding father that most Americans do not realize, such as how Franklin assisted distressed prisoners of war during the War for Independence, or about his expansive views of white male suffrage. Michael has reminded us that it is because of documentary editing projects like the Papers of Benjamin Franklin that we are able to know and discover these little-known details that enrich our knowledge and paint us a fuller picture of how founding fathers and mothers, as well as other men and women, have impacted and shaped not just early American history, but our present-day world. You can find more information about Michael, the Papers of Benjamin Franklin editorial project, plus everything we talked about today on the show notes page for this episode. You'll find it all at benfranklinsworld.com/031. Did you know that I have books to give away? Well, I do. Occasionally, the publishers of guest historians send extra books for me to give away. If you would like to know more information about how you can obtain a free book, please visit benfranklinsworld.com, sign up for the Franklin Gazette newsletter, and click the link in your confirmation email to join Poor Richard's Club, a Facebook group that serves as the official social community of Ben Franklin's World listeners, and the place where I will announce details about how you can receive a free book from one of our past or upcoming guest historians. Have you told your friends, family, and fellow history lovers about our podcast yet? I would sincerely appreciate it if you would tell someone you know about Ben Franklin's World and how much you love it. Word of mouth recommendations are still the best way for us to increase awareness about Ben Franklin's World and to help us keep the podcast visible and findable for our fellow history lovers. Finally, Benjamin Franklin accomplished a lot during his lifetime. What do you think his greatest accomplishment was? Email me your answer, liz@benfranklinsworld.com, or tweet me @LizCovart.
And remember, never leave till tomorrow that which you can do today.